My name is Linda Harrington, and on Christmas morning I learned what my son's love was worth. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee, the kind of scent that pretends everything is fine. Snow pressed its quiet face against the kitchen window, and the wooden table we'd had since David was 12 was crowded with mismatched plates and a rosy ham I'd glazed before dawn. I was laying out forks when Clara, polished as a holiday ornament and twice as sharp, looked at me over the steam of her mug and said, clear enough for the room to hear, "You never contribute anything to this family except stress." The fork slipped from my hand and kissed the floor. David half laughed, the way men laugh when they want to change the subject. Emily stared at her orange juice. The clock above the stove ticked, steady as a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I felt the familiar heat of shame rise. That old companion I've carried since my husband died, and I promised myself I would not become anyone's burden. I wiped my palms on my apron, picked up the fork, and set it down carefully beside Clara's plate. Then I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat. "Clara," I said, keeping my voice level, "if that's how you feel, then the $7,000 I transfer every month for your mortgage ends today." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. David's mouth opened, then closed. Clara blinked as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Somewhere outside, a plow scraped the street. I reached for my tea with the same hands that have bandaged strangers and held babies and signed far too many checks. "You wanted a contribution," I said, meeting their eyes one by one. Consider this my last one. After that Christmas morning outburst, the house didn't feel like my home anymore. I had meant for the holiday to be simple: ham, cinnamon rolls, a few small gifts for Emily, but Clara's words clung to the walls like smoke that refused to clear. When I stood up from the table and walked down the hall to my room, I could hear their voices drop to a whisper, like children caught with matches. I closed the door gently, not to make a scene, but the tremor in my hands betrayed me. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the quilt I'd sewn back when David was little. The pattern was uneven, more love than skill. Each stitch, holding nights when I worked double shifts at the hospital and came home only long enough to check his homework before falling asleep in my uniform. I used to believe sacrifice bought loyalty, that if I poured every ounce of myself into him, he would always know how much I loved him. But that morning, as the wind rattled the windows, I wasn't sure he knew at all. The rest of the day passed in fragments. David knocked once to ask if I wanted dessert, but his eyes never quite met mine. Clara busied herself with dishes, clattering louder than necessary. Emily retreated to her room with a new doll, whispering to it the way children do when the air in a house grows heavy. I brewed another pot of coffee and tried to swallow the lump that had risen in my throat. That evening, after they'd all gone to bed, I walked quietly into the living room. The Christmas lights still twinkled on the tree, soft and forgiving. I sat in David's recliner, the one he'd claimed as his throne since moving me in 2 years ago, and I thought about how I had gotten here. When my husband, Frank, died of a sudden stroke 15 years back, the world went hollow. I threw myself into work at the nursing ward, taking every shift offered, anything to drown out the silence of the house. David was in college then, a lanky boy with a laugh that used to fill our kitchen. He'd call me when he needed money for books or rent, and I always sent it, even if it meant skipping the electric bill for a week. I was proud of him, proud that he would finish the degree his father never had the chance to start. Years later, when David married Clara, I felt something loosen inside me. She was bright, ambitious, and for a while she seemed to bring out the best in him. They bought a house bigger than I thought wise, but they said it was an investment in the future, I told myself not to worry when David asked if I could help with the first few mortgage payments, then a few more, then all of them. $7,000 a month, nearly everything I had saved across decades of night shifts and skipped vacations. He promised he would pay me back once his consulting business took off. But businesses don't stay vague forever. They either bloom or they rot. And as the years stacked, I saw no bloom. Only new cars in the driveway, lavish trips to Florida, and a kitchen renovation I hadn't been consulted on, though my checks had paved the way. Sitting in that recliner on Christmas night, I wondered if Frank would have shaken me awake from this blind devotion long ago. I wondered if he would have told me to draw a line before David crossed it. But I hadn't. Instead, I had let the line blur until Clara could look me in the face and accuse me of never contributing. The thought sent a pulse of anger through me, sharp and hot, but beneath it was something colder, fear. Fear that I had raised a man who knew how to smile while taking everything from me. Fear that my silence had enabled him to grow into someone who saw me as a wallet rather than a mother. I leaned forward and pressed my palms to my knees, steadying myself against the weight of it. The tree lights reflected in the window, tiny bursts of color against the black sky. I thought about the girl down the hall, my granddaughter, and what she was learning each day just by watching. Children notice more than we think. If she saw her grandmother quietly drain dry without protest, what lesson would she carry into her own life? That was the night I decided the silence had to end. I didn't know yet how deep the lies ran, but I knew one truth. If I didn't fight for my own dignity, no one else would. And maybe, just maybe, Emily needed to see me stand up, even if her parents couldn't. When I finally rose from the recliner, the house was still. I turned off the Christmas lights and climbed the stairs slowly, careful not to wake anyone. Tomorrow would bring questions I wasn't ready to answer. But tonight I carried a new resolve, one that tightened in my chest like armor. I closed my bedroom door behind me and whispered into the darkness, as if Frank might still be listening. I won't let him take the rest of me. Part 2, 816 words. The next morning, the house stirred with the sounds of ordinary life. Clara tapping her heels across the kitchen tile, David humming tunelessly while pouring cereal, Emily's soft chatter with her doll. From the hallway, it almost seemed normal, but I knew the ground beneath us had shifted. Their whispers after my announcement still echoed in my head. I brewed my own coffee, deliberately avoiding the fresh pot Clara had set out, and carried it to the sunroom. The glass panes were rimmed with frost, the garden buried under white. For a moment, I let myself imagine silence, a small apartment with only my things, no sharp voices tearing at me. But the daydream snapped when Clara's voice cut through the hall. "Linda," she called, sweet but strained. "Could you sign this quickly, just a routine bank form?" She stood in the doorway holding a folder too carefully, the kind of careful that makes you suspicious. I set down my cup. "Let me look," I said. Her smile flickered. She handed it over. I read the heading, Home Equity Loan Authorization. My name typed neatly, spaces marked for signature. My chest tightened. "I don't remember agreeing to this," I said. "It's just paperwork," she replied quickly. "David thought you'd be fine with it. It's to consolidate debt, save interest." But the words blurred. What I saw was my name being used like a spare key, opening doors I hadn't chosen. I set the folder down and slid it back toward her. "No," I said, firm for once. "If David wants this, he can speak to me himself." She lingered, eyes sharp now, before snapping the folder shut. "Fine," she muttered, heels clicking away. That evening, I crept into the office room where David often worked. I knew it was wrong, but something told me the truth lived in those drawers. The desk smelled faintly of whiskey. I pulled open the top drawer and found stacks of unopened envelopes. My hands shook as I spread them across the desk. Credit card statements screaming red numbers, late fees, balances climbing past 70,000. At the bottom of the pile, folded twice, was a policy document. My heart thudded as I read the words: life insurance contract. The insured, Linda Harrington. Beneficiary, David Harrington. Payout, $500,000. The room spun. My own son had taken out a policy on my life without my knowledge. My throat went dry. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, imagining what kind of man looks at his mother and sees $500,000 instead of a hand that raised him. The floor creaked. I shoved the papers back, but Clara was there in the doorway, arms crossed. "You shouldn't be in here," she said. I held up the insurance document. "You forged this?" Her face didn't flinch, and that scared me more than anger. "David said you'd panic if you knew. It's just security for Emily. If something happened..." Her calmness chilled me. The words weren't an apology. They were justification. "You forged my name," I whispered. "That's a crime." Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think the police will listen to you? You've been signing things for years, moving money around. Who do you think they'll believe? The frail widow or the couple running a business?" Her confidence cracked something inside me. This wasn't confusion or desperation. It was partnership. She and David together, wearing my devotion like armor while they drained me. I folded the paper and slipped it into my sweater pocket. "We'll see," I said, brushing past her. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the policy, hearing Frank's voice in memory: "Always keep records. Linda." Paper trails tell the truth. He had balanced our checkbook with meticulous care. I realized then that the only way to protect myself was to let the truth speak louder than my fear. The next morning I called an old friend, Marjorie, who had been a social worker. I told her everything in a trembling voice. She didn't laugh, didn't doubt. She said, "This is elder financial abuse. You need a lawyer, and you need the police." The words elder abuse stung, as if admitting weakness. But beneath the sting was relief. There was a name for what was happening to me, and it wasn't just bad parenting or poor judgment. It was a crime. Marjorie connected me to an attorney who specialized in cases like mine. When I met with him, he didn't blink at the stack of documents I carried in my purse. He flipped through credit card statements, the loan form, the insurance policy. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. "They've been exploiting you," he said simply. "The mortgage transfers, the forged signature, the policy, it's all part of a pattern. The police will be interested. But Linda, you have to be prepared. This may mean testifying against your own son." My stomach knotted. The thought of David in handcuffs made me ill. But then I remembered Clara's voice in the office, so steady, so unapologetic. And I thought of Emily growing up believing that lies were family currency. "I'm prepared," I said, though my voice cracked. "I can't let them keep doing this." As I left the attorney's office, snow was falling again, soft and indifferent. I pulled my coat tighter and walked slower than usual, each step carrying the weight of betrayal, but also the faint spark of something else: resolve. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shifting. They had counted on my silence. They had mistaken my love for blindness. But the truth was now in my pocket, folded sharp as a blade, and I was no longer afraid to use it. The police didn't come with flashing lights or handcuffs, not at first. They came with notebooks and calm voices. Two detectives who met me in a quiet corner of the library because I was terrified of David or Clara overhearing. I laid the papers on the table like a gambler showing her losing hand. Statements, the loan authorization, the insurance policy. Their eyes sharpened as they read. One of them, Detective Mills, tapped the margin with his pen and said, This is forgery. It's also fraud. We can work with this." The words steadied me, but fear tangled in my chest. This wasn't some neighbor dispute. This was my son. I kept thinking of the day I taught him how to ride a bike, how he fell and scraped his knee, and how I ran to scoop him up. And now I was placing him in the path of the law. They asked me to help gather more. "If Clara or David slip up in conversation," Mills said, "if you can get them talking about these loans or the insurance, it'll strengthen the case." My throat went dry, but I nodded. The next afternoon, I agreed to meet Clara at a cafe downtown. She had texted me, oddly cheerful, suggesting we clear the air. I slipped the small recording device into my purse before leaving. My palms were clammy the whole drive. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, a cruel reminder of the Christmas morning that had started all this. Clara sat by the window, hair pulled into a perfect knot, her nails clicking against the coffee cup. She smiled thinly when I sat down. "You know," she began, "this whole situation has been blown out of proportion. David he struggles with money sometimes, but everything we've done was to protect the family." "Protect?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She leaned in, lowering her tone. "Do you think it was easy getting that policy in place? David had to convince the broker you'd agreed. I signed a few things because he couldn't risk you saying no. It was stressful, Linda, but it's for Emily's future. If anything happened to you, at least she'd be secure." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. My purse sat on the chair beside me, the tiny device glowing red, capturing every syllable. Clara sipped her latte as if she hadn't just admitted to a crime. When I returned home, I gave the recording to the detectives. They exchanged a glance that told me it was damning. Still, they warned. David might react when he realized pressure was closing in. They were right. 2 nights later, David called me, his voice shaking. He asked me to meet him in the parking lot of a shuttered strip mall on the edge of town. He said Clara was in trouble, that some men were threatening her over debts, and only I could help. The panic in his tone was familiar, the same panic he'd used as a boy when caught lying about schoolwork, but something darker threaded through it now. I almost said no, but some stubborn piece of me still wanted to believe he needed me. So I drove, heart pounding, praying the detectives were wrong. The parking lot was a black sheet of ice, lit only by one failing lamp. David stood near Clara's SUV, shoulders hunched, a gun glinting in his hand. My breath caught. He waved me closer. "She's been taken," he hissed. "They want money. They'll hurt her if you don't pay." He shoved his phone at me. On the screen was a photo of Clara tied to a chair, gagged. My knees weakened, but something was off. The wallpaper behind her was familiar. My mind clicked back to the high school play David had starred in, a cheap set painted to look like a parlor. I remembered sitting in the audience, applauding. And there it was, the same crooked wallpaper pattern in the photo. My fear hardened into clarity. "This isn't real," I whispered. David's eyes darted, the gun trembling. "It's real enough. You wire me $50,000 or you'll never see her again." I forced myself to stand tall, though my legs shook. "David, that photo is from your play, the set you built senior year. You staged this." His mouth opened, closed. The gun dipped. For a moment, he was that boy again, caught with matches behind the shed. His shoulders sagged, the bravado draining away. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I owe them. I owe everyone. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I took a step closer, my hands raised. "Put it down, David. Please. This isn't the way." Blue and red lights flared across the ice, silent until the last moment. Detectives poured out, weapons drawn, voices commanding. David froze, then let the gun clatter to the ground. They pressed him against the hood while I stood shaking, my breath visible in the freezing air. As they cuffed him, his eyes found mine. For the first time in years, there was no charm, no excuses, just raw defeat. And maybe, deep down, a plea for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. Clara was arrested 2 days later. The recording sealed her role, and the paperwork painted the rest of the picture. The house grew quiet, stripped of their presence. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning. For the son I had lost long before the police cars arrived. Still, beneath the grief, a different current stirred. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something sturdier. The certainty that silence had nearly destroyed me, and breaking it had saved me. The trial came faster than I expected. Months blurred into hearings, statements, evidence sealed in folders with my name on them. I sat in the courtroom, the air smelling of wood polish and nerves, watching my son in a suit that hung loose on his frame. David wouldn't look at me, not once. Clara sat 2 rows behind him, lips pressed tight, her own attorney whispering in her ear. When the verdict was read, my chest ached in ways no doctor could fix. 7 years for David, 4 for Clara. The gavel fell, and the sound rang like the closing of a vault. People whispered, papers shuffled, but I stayed seated, my hands clenched together. I thought of Frank, of how proud he'd been the day David was born, and wondered if pride could rot into something unrecognizable. Afterward, I stood in the corridor outside the courtroom. David was being led away, wrists cuffed, his eyes rimmed red. For the briefest second, he glanced at me. It wasn't hate in his stare. It was emptiness. And emptiness hurt more than hatred ever could. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. The house, stripped of Clara's sharp perfume and David's booming voice, felt like mine again. I cleaned out their papers, boxed up old clothes, and for the first time in years, the space didn't feel borrowed. It felt like breathing. I joined a support group for seniors who had been scammed or exploited by their own families. Sitting in a circle of strangers who carried the same wounds, I realized I wasn't alone. One woman had lost her savings to a grandson's schemes. Another had nearly signed over her property to a niece. We shared tears and coffee, and little by little, shame loosened its grip. Speaking my story aloud was like opening a window in a room that had been shut too long. Then one afternoon, as winter began to thaw, a small envelope arrived. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Dear Grandma, I miss you. Mom says she can't write right now, but I wanted to. Can we make cinnamon rolls together again when you're ready? Love, Emily. Tears blurred the page. I pressed the letter to my chest and let myself cry. Not the bitter sobs of betrayal, but the gentler kind that follow hope. Emily was still there, unspoiled by her parents' mistakes, a bridge between what had been broken and what might still be healed. That night, I baked cinnamon rolls, the house filling once more with the scent of sugar and spice. I set one aside on a plate for Emily, imagining her small hands tearing it apart. For the first time in a long while, I felt the warmth of possibility. I don't know if forgiveness will ever come fully, or if David will someday find a way back to the man I once believed he could be. But I know this: family isn't measured in mortgages or policies or forged signatures. Family is truth. It is respect. It is the quiet courage to say enough when enough has been taken. And in that courage, I finally found my place again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.